Welcome, I'm Jon Caldara, president of the Independence Institute and your devil's advocate. I've been looking forward to this one for a long, long time. And he's the Pete Townsend of economics, really. I think that's a good way to put it. Walter E. Williams, so glad to have you with us.
Well, thank you, John.
And welcome to Colorado. We're really glad to have you here. Now, you flew out for an event that we're doing, and I'm thrilled to have you here. We flew you out on a private jet. What would have happened if we flew you out on commercial? I'm just curious about it.
I might have been in jail because I'm not as compliant with the TSA as most Americans. As a matter of fact, a good name, what the pilots call the TSA, they say it's an acronym for thugs standing around.
Well, wait, they're there to protect us from threats. They're there to keep us from shoe bombers and underwear bombers and all sorts of hijackers and people with utility knives that can do real danger.
Yeah. Well, what started me stop flying commercial, it was a number of years ago, and I had carry-on baggage. And pretend that you are a TSA person. And so the guy found an eyeglass repair kit in my carry-on. And he told me I could take the screws, but I could not take the screwdriver. And the screwdriver is about that big. And so I said, who in the world ever heard of an airplane being hijacked with the eyeglass screwdriver? He said, wait here. And his supervisor came up, and he said, well, what's wrong? And so he said, leave it. Either it stays here or you don't get on the plane. And so then, and people who had invited me had to spend a whole lot of money setting a banquet and stuff like this. So I did go, but I said that's the last time.
But it was just a screwdriver, Walter.
Yeah.
You could buy another one. What made it so strong to you that you couldn't say, well, for the sake of safety, for the sake of making sure that our airwaves are secure, that people can fly and feel comfortable, and so that the terrorists don't win, this 2-inch long eyeglass screwdriver, I will part with it.
Yes,
for America.
I'm not willing to. See, that's the difference between me and most Americans. Many Americans will do anything, let these people do anything to them in the name of safety, as long as it'll keep us safe. And this is a show where maybe kids are watching, so I won't say too many things.
Trust me, there's no kids watching. They're not even adults watching. Don't worry. So, but where do you draw that line then? I mean, are you saying there shouldn't be any screening at all going on an airplane?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think that maybe the one solution is that allow all the passengers to carry pistols. And I'm wondering who would hijack a plane with all the passengers carrying pistols.
Would you trust me with a pistol on an airplane?
Well, as long as I had one.
As long as you had one. You're the head of the economics department. You were the chairman, and I
was the chairman.
Yeah. But you of George Mason University. What makes that econ department different than most schools' economics department?
Well, I think virtually all of my colleagues. There's just one that I suspect might be different. We're free market economists. We believe in the Constitution of the United States, and we believe in personal liberty. Now, there are not many economics departments anywhere in the world where you find a faculty of maybe 35 people, professors, who believe in individual freedom as envisioned by the great philosophers John Locke and others who influenced the founders of our nation.
Now, I'm a survivor of the University of Colorado at Boulder, and I had a great time, great parties. I'm an econ major, and I did not have a single conservative economics professor. Why?
Well,
why is there such a difference when it comes to the academics that you at George Mason, you're the oddity?
Oh, that's just the economics department. The rest of the campus is like...
Oh, the rest of the campus.
Yes.
All right, keep it with economics, though. Why is that, on the study of economics, why is it so Keynesian? Why is it so government-centric that the government can solve our problems? Why is that taught in so many universities?
Well, I think Keynes, the Keynesian ideas, it was a godsend to politicians who always wanted bigger government. They always wanted to be in our pockets. And the Keynesian ideas of government intervention was right down their alley. And so people who have contempt for personal liberty, they love Keynesian ideas. See, I believe
that's a strong statement. Let me jump on that for. And those who don't know, the idea of Keynesianism was John Maynard Keynes, who said government can pull us out of economic hardship by priming the pump, throwing money into the system, getting government involved, and it will spur the economy. Why is it that if somebody supports that, they don't support personal property and personal liberty? Explain that jump to me.
Well, when the government spends money for various programs, well, they don't get the money from the Tooth Fairy or the Santa Claus. The only way that government can spend $1 is to first, through intimidation, threats, and coercion, confiscate that dollar from some other American. And if you think I'm being too loose with the terminology, intimidation, threats, and coercion, you have April 15th to check me out on this. That is, government is in the business. Most of the federal budget is spent on taking the property of one American and giving it to another to whom it does not belong. Now, I believe the government ought to be involved in the constitutionally mandated functions of the federal government as enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution.
How do they pay for that then? You say confiscating money. Don't they have to confiscate money to do those, what you consider to be legitimate functions of government in Article 1, Section 8?
That is absolutely right. And as Thomas Paine said, government under the best of circumstances is a necessary evil. Under the worst of circumstances, an intolerable one. So we do need some government and we do need taxation. But because government, the essence of government is coercion, then we ought to keep it as small as possible.
Would you
now, keep in mind, I might add, today the federal government spends almost 25% of our GDP. But from 1787 until 1920, except during wartime, the federal government was 3% of the GDP. And we became the most powerful and the richest nation on the face of the earth, with government being very, very small.
When government takes, well, how do you decide? Article 1, Section 8, not to get too wonky, lists out what the Congress can do. It can levy taxes, it can build roads, it can have post office, it can have treaties, it can declare war, it can regulate commerce between the states. It does these fine things. Has the federal government gone beyond that?
Oh yes. I mean, if you
say yes, where's the Supreme Court to agree with you?
Well, the Thomas Jefferson and Madison, they warned us. They said we should not allow the Supreme Court to be the final arbiter of what is constitutional and what is not constitutional, or else we'd be living under an oligarchy. But look, if you ask the question, what are the constitutional functions of the federal government? You just go to the founders. And James, look, anybody can look at Federalist Paper 45, and Federalist Paper, for those who don't know, was written by John Jay and Hamilton and Madison to try to convince the citizens of New York to ratify the Constitution. It was the advertising
brochure to get you into this car.
That's right, absolutely right. And in Federalist Paper 45, Madison is explaining the Constitution. He said, the powers that we've delegated to the federal government are few and well-defined, and restricted mostly to external affairs. Those left with the people and the states are indefinite and numerous. Now, if you turn that upside down, you'd have what we have today. The powers of the federal government are indefinite and numerous.
How did that happen? I mean, I'm not going to disagree with you, but let me play devil's advocate, thus the show. Yeah. How did we get here? I mean, obviously, these have passed constitutional muster by the Supreme Court. And now there is a sense that the federal government, not the state government, but the federal government can help us out of situations, including what we have now. What if you could boil it down to one point where it broke down? Where is that point?
I think it's probably ignorance and contempt for liberty. And now the ignorance part of it is that if you look at the inception of our nation from 1787 until 1930, we had recessions, we had depressions, sometimes they call them panics, some last 2 years, some last 5 years. And nobody in that interval thought that the federal government ought to be involved in getting out of it. It wasn't until the Hoover administration and the Roosevelt administration that somebody thought the federal government ought to be involved in getting us out of the depression that it caused in the first place. And it turned what would have been a 2 or 3 year sharp downturn into a 10-year affair, the longest depression that we ever had. So there's a better record for government doing nothing than government doing something.
Was there one point in history where we turned that corner? Was it Hoover and Roosevelt, or was it Bush and Obama?
I think it was during the New Deal legislation. When there is such a calamity in our country, with the Great Depression, people started demanding, and politicians started serving people. Things like the minimum wage in 1938 was found constitutional, where all before it was found unconstitutional. So there are many things that were made.
Why should it be unconstitutional? I mean, the idea is so popular, and it's seeped into the culture that it's a given. That if you go out and work, I'm going to guarantee you're going to get $7 an hour, or whatever it is. The idea that I might work for my neighbor part-time and get $5 an hour, but I won't have to commute, I have a flexible schedule, I help her out, she helps me out, and it works out perfectly. We're now barred from that free association. But why should it be unconstitutional for the government to say, hey, there's a floor. Nobody gets paid less than this. Kids aren't going to be working in mines. We're going to have some basic control of safety and welfare.
Well, we have many laws, safety laws now, that protect kids not only from working in mines, but in plush air-conditioned offices. The same laws. Now, but the point is freedom of contract. That is, if I want to work for you for $4 an hour, and you wish to pay me $4 an hour, who else's business is it to say, well, look, that kind of exchange is not going to happen. And if you insist, we'll put you in jail, and if you resist, we'll shoot you.
Let's move it forward. This last decade has been pretty amazing. I have never witnessed growth of government like this in my lifetime. I'm 48 years old. And I remember some bad economic times around Jimmy Carter, the beginning of the Reagan administration. But I was young enough, that was the old man's problem. I was in high school chasing skirts and life was good. Now it's different. Now I see that we're in an economic slowdown or a depression or a recession or however you want to count it. Government's tried a few things. We've tried a stimulus package. We've tried a bailout package. We've tried other things. Why hasn't it worked? Why hasn't Obama been able to spur this economy the way he promised?
Well, if I told you I can sit here and make pigs fly, would you believe me?
Well, yes, because I like you.
But you're asking government to do the impossible. It can't. I mean, if government could control the economic cycle, why would we have economic cycle to begin with? That is, government just outlaw, a depression.
There are other Nobel-winning economists that say, the problem is not that we're in debt. The problem is that we haven't spent enough yet. That Keynesian thing works. We just need to pump it more. The reason Reagan was successful was not because he cuts taxes. No, he increased debt spending. We need more debt spending. Historically, how big is our debt right now? I mean, how do people understand the size of it?
Well, I think one way of looking at our debt is that, excuse me, one way of looking at our debt is that our debt is 105% of GDP. That is all that we produce a year. It's about $16 trillion. And in 1970, our debt was 34% of GDP. A country like Greece, which is in deep trouble, their debt is 160% of GDP, and Spain and Portugal and Italy. And you say, which way are Americans moving? Are we moving towards Greece and Spain and Portugal, or are we moving away? The answer is unambiguously that we're moving in that direction, and we just cannot create debt forever.
You're an academic, but you're also different than most academics, that you've got some salesmanship to you. That is, I remember seeing you on Milt Friedman's Free to Choose series, which I thought was just a great bit of education. You fill in for Rush Limbaugh, or at least fill in for him pretty regularly in the past. By the way, how did you land that kind of gig? Let me fill in for Rush Limbaugh.
Well,
can you put in a word?
No, Rush was probably, he wanted to go on vacation. He probably asking himself, who's the second best talk show host in the world?
No,
so he said, let me call Walter.
I can tell you from all talk show hosts, we have one paranoia, which is we don't want to ever go on vacation because we know whoever replaces us there is going to get the job permanently. We're that paranoid.
No, well, Rush doesn't. He's a genius. I mean,
is he?
Nobody can beat him in talk show.
Well, I mean, but he's bombastic. He's opinionated. People think that he's vulgar, and does he sell? I mean, it's good talk radio, but to get an economist, I mean, that doesn't compute to say, let's get an economist. Economists are boring. How in the world did you land that gig?
Well, I'm not boring. But I look at it as my big classroom. And it's an opportunity to try to sell my fellow American on the moral superiority of personal liberty and its main ingredient, limited government. And that's just my big classroom of millions and millions of Americans. And it's a difficult job. It should not be a difficult job in the United States, but it's a difficult job trying to sell our fellow Americans on the moral superiority.
Why is it morally superior? I mean, we want outcomes. We want outcomes we want people to have good lives. We want people to have enough to eat and have enough shelter and have the basics. Why is liberty morally superior?
Well, because well, let me ask you this question. Let me interview you. That is, do you believe that it is moral to forcibly use one person to serve the purpose of somebody else?
As long as I'm not the one serving, then absolutely yes.
Okay, so you're saying you believe in slavery because
as long as I'm not the slave.
That's a very good working definition of slavery. The forcible use of one person to serve the purposes of another. And if you look at most of the federal spending in our country is that of forcing one American to serve the purpose of another. Look, 48% of our fellow Americans have no federal income tax liability. And that's a very dangerous state of affairs.
Why?
The reason why is because
they pay payroll taxes, they pay income taxes, they pay sales taxes. If they rent an apartment, part of that rent goes to the property taxes. Yeah. You can't say that they're not paying taxes.
I'm saying federal taxes. And so these people who have no federal income tax liability, they become natural constituents for big spending politicians. Because if you're not paying any federal income taxes, what do you care about what federal income taxes are? And moreover, during the Bush years with the so-called Bush tax cuts, they weren't that popular. Why? Because if you're not paying federal taxes, why should you be happy about a tax cut? The only thing a tax cut means, it's possibly a threat to your handouts.
Well, then talk to me a little bit about the safety net. In that people, I think, agree with you that you should be free to make your money, you should be free to keep it, but we also have a collective sense of taking care of people who can't take care of themselves. I've heard people say we judge a society by how it cares for those who can't care for themselves. And we want that safety net. Are you arguing there shouldn't be that safety net? That safety net looks like Social Security and Medicaid. It looks like welfare to help those people.
They're just different names for forcibly using one person to serve the purpose of somebody else. For example, suppose I saw an elderly lady sleeping on a grate in downtown Denver. She's cold, she's hungry, and she needs some medical attention. And I walked up to you with a gun in my hand and say, look, John, give me your $200. Then having gotten your $200, I go down, buy the lady some medical attention, some food, and some shelter. Would I be guilty of a crime? Of course I'd be guilty of crime. I'd be guilty of theft, because how do you define theft? Theft is taking the rightful property of one person and giving it to another to whom it doesn't belong. Now, all the viewers would agree with me on that. But here's the problem. Is there any conceptual distinction between that act, where I walked up to you and took your $200, and when the agents of the United States Congress, namely the IRS, come up to me and say, Williams, you know that $200 that you made last week, that you plan to buy a nice bottle of Lafite Rothschild Bordeaux wine, you'll give it to us, and we will go downtown and help the lady out. The only distinction between those two acts is that the first is illegal theft, and the second is legal theft.
But the second came through a process where our representatives that we vote for collectively have made a decision that we have put them into power to represent our viewpoints. And our viewpoints are...
It's not my viewpoint.
Well, you're on the losing side of that democracy. So talk to me, doesn't democracy run into this problem of pure liberty?
The founders of our nation had contempt for the idea of democracy. You don't find the word democracy in any of our founding documents, whether it's the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution of the United States. And you read statement after statement, and those statements are available at my website, walterewilliams.com, of founders and their statements about democracy. And matter of fact, let me ask you a question. When we pledge allegiance to the flag, is it for the democracy for which it stands?
It's for the republic.
It was that Civil War song, the battle hymn, was it the battle hymn of the democracy?
Point taken.
But the point is, the founders intended us to be a republic because they found the idea of democracy offensive.
But even as a republic, the Congress has been elected to represent us. We don't have direct democracy there. And the Congress, acting through the power of that republic, has built that safety net that takes away your wonderful Rothschild wine and buys medical services for the homeless lady.
Show me in the Constitution where the Congress is authorized to do this. Now, look, we admit that James Madison is the acknowledged father of the Constitution. In 1794, Congress appropriated $15,000 to help some French refugees. James Madison stood on the floor of the House irate, and he said, and I'm virtually quoting him, "I cannot undertake to lay my finger on that article in the Constitution that authorizes Congress to take the money of their constituents for the purposes of benevolence." That's James Madison. And if you look at the federal budget, 2/3 to 3/4 of it today is for the purpose of benevolence. I mean, and the American people, the tragedy of it is that if any person were running for high office today, stating the values of somebody like Madison or Jefferson or Adam or George Washington, they would be run out of town on the rail by the American people. The American people would have contempt for these great men of our past.
Are you suggesting that there is no governmental role for a social safety net?
Yes, I'm saying that. Now keep in mind, don't misunderstand. I believe in helping our fellow man in need. I believe that reaching into your own pockets to help your fellow man in need is praiseworthy and laudable. Reaching into somebody else's pockets to help your fellow man in need is despicable. And for those of us who are Christians, I'm very sure when God gave Moses the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," he did not mean thou shalt not steal unless you get a majority vote in Congress.
All right, let me bring it to the more practical. People don't understand simple economics today. It's not taught. People don't understand the liberty of how our nation was founded. And instead, they emote, and understandably so, they see problems, they want it solved. Government is the most direct seeming route to help that lady who needs help. How in the world, we've only got a few minutes left, how in the world do you take on the issue to educate Americans to the point where they become like Madison again and start giving of their own charity?
It's impossible.
So is it lost?
People, yes.
Is the union lost?
If you ask the question, look, let me ask you, put it this way. Are Americans anyway, as human beings, anyway systematically different from the Romans, the French, the Portuguese, the Spanish, or the British? Those are great empires of the past, and they went down the tubes for doing precisely what we're doing. And so I'm afraid that history will read that there was this once a great nation, and it went down the tubes. If in 1887 at Queen Victoria's Jubilee, and if someone had said that Great Britain would become a third-rate nation, challenged on the high seas by a sixth-rate nation such as Argentina, and almost lose, they would have been put in the insane asylum. It was inconceivable. The same thing about our country.
Can this country be saved? Can those values be returned?
Well, that's my
is it
job.
Too late?
That's my job. That's what I'm telling you. I'm trying to sell my fellow Americans on the moral superiority of personal liberty.
You're failing. You're failing.
Well, I'm going to try.
All right, you do great. You do great. You do great for the ones who want to listen. But there's so many who don't want to listen.
Well, we're going to try to get more of them to listen, and we're going to try to get the people that are coming to the celebration tonight. We're going to try to recruit them. And we're going to try to tell them, look. Go out and tell your fellow man that liberty is morally superior.
Let me ask you in the last minute here, put out your crystal ball. You say that America is heading towards the trash heap. When? Are we there? Is this crisis, is this debt going to be the one that pushes us over? Are we at a point of no return? Bankruptcy and the Greek economy is in our future, and there's no way around it.
Well, unless we get our act together pretty soon, it's surely in our future. I'm not in the crystal ball business. I'm not saying that the U.S. is going to go down the tubes, but what I am saying is that I would hate to be up in heaven and watching you and your children and my children live in a banana republic.
What's the one thing we need to do?
I've been saying it over and over again to try to get our fellow man to see congressmen. You can't change congressmen. You have to change the American people, and because the congressmen are doing precisely what the American people want them to do, and that is take what belongs to one American and give it to them. So we have to change what the American people want, and it's a moral lesson. And it's very difficult.
And when there are more Americans receiving things from congressmen than being taken from a congressman, then it's all over. Walter, thank you so much. This is such a treat for me, I can't tell you. Please visit walterewilliams.com. Check out on his work at George Mason University. Read his columns, it's incredible. And while you're there, check out independenceinstitute.org. Tell a friend about the Independence Institute and listen for me on Sundays on KHOW. See you next week.